Hello film fans, and welcome to this episode of the Sherlockian. Now, there have been many different portrayals of Sherlock Holmes over the years. Indeed, I'd argue that he ranks alongside characters like Doctor Who and James Bond as the most frequently portrayed character in popular culture. That being said, everyone has their favourites of course, and as do I, so I thought for this video, I'd run down my top 10 favourite Sherlock Holmeses that have appeared so far. Let's start our rundown, starting at first with number 10. At number 10 on my list is a rather surprising first choice, namely Jason Gray Stamford. Now, Stamford plays Sherlock Holmes in the children's series Sherlock Holmes in the 22nd Century. Now, I must confess, when I first heard of this show, I thought, oh, come on. I mean, Sherlock Holmes in the modern era is one thing, but Sherlock Holmes in the future, I mean, what do they think they're doing? But I must confess that this show is rather charming. Stamford plays the role quite straight. It's a very typical performance of Sherlock Holmes, I think it's fair to say. I mean, it's for children after all. He's refined, he's intelligent, he's intellectual, he has brilliant deductive powers, he's occasionally slightly snide, but on the whole fairly polite. Overall, the character comes across as very likeable, and indeed rather charming. Evidently his stay in cryostasis has improved his temperament somewhat. The one thing I would say is that there's not a lot of emotion behind Stamford's performance. I mean, he's generally quite one note in that he's very calm even under pressure. The one recurring thing that I do quite like about this show is that Moriarty returns, of course, as a recurring villain. He's evidently managed to clone himself or something. It's all very mysterious and futuristic. But the one thing I like is the way that Sherlock always seems surprised every time he sees. He goes, Moriarty! As if after fighting for 3 centuries, he still hasn't quite got over the idea that Moriarty is a villain. I always find that rather charming. But overall, it's a very likeable performance. And as I said, I think that means it deserves number 10 on this list.
Elementary, my dear Watson.
At number 9 on the list is a possibly slightly controversial choice, namely Benedict Cumberbatch. Now, Cumberbatch has always been quite a difficult person for me to assess as a Sherlock Holmes fan, as indeed the entire show Sherlock was for me when I first saw it. He's obviously meant to be a slimmed down version of the classic character, hence he has very little of the sort of iconography of Sherlock Holmes, if you like, the long coat, the funny deerstalker hat, and the pipe. And this I approve of, but they also slimmed down quite a lot of things that I liked about the character. So, as I'm sure you know, Cumberbatch's performance as Sherlock is quite snide. He's a deductive genius, he's a sociopath, and he finds interacting with others, particularly those who he considers not as clever as he is, which essentially is everybody apart from Moriarty. He finds it very difficult, and he's not above showing that he doesn't like being with them very much at times. Indeed, he comes across as quite unpleasant to live with. And sometimes I wonder why John Watson hangs around with him, which of course is addressed in the show, but on the whole it's a very extreme performance of Sherlock Holmes. There's none of that humanity that you get in other actors. Like, for instance, Jeremy Brett's performance of Sherlock could go into quite extreme ranges at times, and he and Watson would have arguments, but you'd also see the more human side, which I don't think Cumberbatch's version does as much or as well. Of course, this isn't a criticism of Cumberbatch as an actor. He's a much better actor than I am. And indeed, in the Christmas special, where they, Sherlock imagines he and Watson back in Victorian times, Cumberbatch gives a far more, I think, typical role of Sherlock Holmes, a more typical portrayal, if you like. And I really quite liked him as that, which is why he's on number 9, on number 10 in the list. Overall, I think Cumberbatch, brings a lot to the part, and he certainly seems to have researched it a lot, which, as a Sherlockian, I, really respect. But for me, that lack of humanity at times means that he's in the upper echelons of the list rather than further down it. So at number 8 on the list, we have the only audio-only version of Sherlock Holmes on this list, namely Nicholas Briggs, who plays him in the Big Finish audio dramas. Now, I really like Nicholas Briggs a lot. For one thing, he, not single-handedly, but he did help to bring about the creation of the Doctor Who Big Finish products, which I'm a huge fan of. And I really like him as Sherlock Holmes. I think he gets the voice down really, really well. He has a sense of authority there, but also a sense of humanity in his voice. There is a particular episode of his Sherlock Holmes that I really enjoy, which I think was released just as a short little Christmas feature, and you can find it online for free. And it has him basically getting mellow on brandy on Christmas Eve and waiting up to see if he can catch Father Christmas. Obviously, it's a bit fantastical, as indeed are quite a lot of the Big Finish Sherlock Holmes series. Some of Conan Doyle's work, of course, did almost edge into fantasy at times, or at least science fiction. And the Big Finish stuff really sort of takes that on, and it goes towards to more that range of the series rather than the more realistic stuff that most portrayals of Sherlock Holmes tend to congregate towards. So yeah, I really like Briggs in the role. I think he does a very good job. Now, on to number 7. At number 7, we have Henry Cavill, who of course plays the role in the Netflix film Enola Holmes. Now, this role was incredibly controversial. They were even sued by the Conan Doyle estate, no less, because they'd portrayed Sherlock Holmes as having emotions. And apparently they claimed that they had a right to Sherlock Holmes' emotions, and I don't pretend to really understand the legal case. But all I know is that I really liked Cavill's portrayal. I know some people think that he made the character a bit too emotional, and indeed he himself said that the character was even more emotional before the scriptwriters and himself worked together to pare it back. But I like it. I particularly like the way, obviously, because the film is mainly about Enola, not Sherlock, we see Sherlock from Enola's perspective. And I really love the way she kind of hero worships her older brother. The other thing, of course, is brilliant, is that Cavill does indeed give the character a bit more emotion, but he never goes too far. You get the sense that this Sherlock Holmes does have emotions, but by careful use of logic and reasoning, pared them back a bit, which of course is difficult when you're dealing with your younger sister, but probably an advantage when you're trying to solve crimes. The other thing I like is that this Sherlock is quietly eccentric, unlike some others, which we'll come to a bit later. This Sherlock Holmes does things that would have seemed eccentric in the 19th century, but maybe a casual viewer, or one that's not been trained as a historian like I am, or a bit of a history geek, wouldn't notice. So, for instance, Sherlock doesn't wear a hat in public. Now, this doesn't seem very weird to us now because virtually no one wears a hat unless there's a reason to, like it's a bit hot. But in Victorian times, it was incredibly unusual to see anybody without a hat, male or female. And indeed, this is commented on by Mycroft in the film when Enola turns up to greet her brothers without wearing a hat.
Where's your hat and your gloves?
Well, I have a hat. Just makes my head itch. And I have no gloves.
She has no gloves. Clearly not Mycroft.
But what we don't realise from a modern perspective is that for a gentleman to be seen without his hat was, a bit of a social faux pas. There's even a famous story about, and during the 1900s, which was set, well, about the time of this film, in fact, there was a case where, in order to try and make a particular lord stay in the House of Lords for an important vote, one of his friends actually stole his hat and coat because he presumed that he wouldn't be seen in public without it, so he wouldn't be able to leave the House of Lords without voting. But be that as it may, I really appreciate that kind of real attention to detail, as indeed I do the wonderful graphics they use, where they make it look as if the Strand magazine illustrations, which they've very cleverly edited Cavill's face into, is virtually perfect. It makes them look like they're moving. It's such a cool thing. I really geeked out over that, I must confess. Now, at number 6, we have Sir Ian McKellen, who played Sherlock Holmes in the absolutely fantastic films Mr. Holmes. Now, McKellen is probably, in terms of status, the most prestigious actor ever to play the role of Sherlock Holmes. I mean, the man is a legend. He was Gandalf in Lord of the Rings. He was Magneto in the X-Men series. He plays so many wonderful roles. And indeed, I think he is absolutely fantastic as this older portrayal of Sherlock Holmes. For those of you who haven't seen the film, essentially it centres around Holmes right at the end of his life. So from Conan Doyle's writings, we know that Sherlock Holmes goes off to retire when he gets old to the South Downs, where he keeps bees and potters about and enjoys himself. But Mr. Holmes looks at the sort of more darker side of this. Basically, as Holmes gets older, he obviously, starts to forget things, and though he is still a brilliant, intelligent man, the onset of things like dementia means that his deductive powers begin to fail. And I really like the way it looks at this like old man who essentially has nothing else left to really live for. His life was his work, and now he can't do his work anymore, and he's retired. He doesn't really have anything else to do. And I love the idea as well of this man who's plagued by regret. It's not a thing we particularly look at Sherlock Holmes very much in most portrayals of him, but indeed in the books, because Conan Doyle's character is so wonderfully vast, there are times when Sherlock Holmes has these great clouds of melancholy come over him, and he descends into what is essentially, depression. And indeed, he worries about the fact that, he's failed one person, and that, a client might have died, and if he'd only been quicker on the uptake, they might still be alive. He really carries that burden of guilt, and I think Mr. Holmes really explores this in a really interesting and fascinating way. I also like a number of other things about the film. There's a nice little cameo where he goes to a cinema and watches a film where he is the main character, presumably based on the books by Dr. Watson, and there's a wonderful, I suppose you'd call it a parody of the Basil Rathbone films, which I'm a massive fan of, and it's nice to see, Holmes, laughing along with the audience. He really seems to be enjoying himself, which is, nice. The other thing I like is, of course, Holmes' relationship with the young boy who's the son of his housekeeper. It's really sweet the way they interact with each other, and indeed the little boy becomes essentially like a very small version of Dr. Watson and gives Holmes something else to live for. It allows him to sort of relive his glory days in the company of another person. I also particularly like this scene.
This sentence, to be exact.
One day into the room came a young man in newly pressed, albeit inexpensive, clothes. Clothes are freshly pressed. He's a young man, though, not expensive clothes.
Then his wife must press them. Men don't have the talent, and he can't afford a servant to do so.
Very good.
That's how you knew it was about the wife.
Well, no. When you're a detective and a man comes to visit you, it's usually about his wife.
But yeah, overall, this is just a fantastic portrayal. It's not a view of Holmes we typically see, but one I think which is absolutely brilliantly constructed. It's almost like Sherlock Holmes in the real world, if you like, which I think is a really interesting thing to explore. So at number 5, we have the almost complete opposite of the Mr. Holmes character. We have Robert Downey Jr.'s Sherlock Holmes. Now, I really, really love the two films which he's in, but even a massive fan of the films as I am, can admit that they are essentially parodies of Sherlock Holmes, which I think is really great because they're unlike things like Holmes and Watson, which were a bit more perhaps a spiteful kind of parody, whereas this is a brilliant parody because it's outlandish and silly, but it remains really faithful to the original characters in the books, amazingly so. It just, stretches them a little bit. So, for example, Holmes in the books is, slightly eccentric. I think it's fair to say, he keeps his tobacco in a Persian slipper. He occasionally practices with his revolver indoors, and marks, V for victory on the different walls of the flat, which nowadays would get him arrested. And, he generally does things that are, a little bit unusual, but which you could imagine people doing. Whereas in the film, particularly the first film, it shows, Holmes's sanctum sanctorum, if you like, his rooms at Baker Street. They look like an opium den. They're really dark and dingy. And I love the idea that this film isn't afraid to laugh at itself and indeed at the character, but in a very affectionate way. So, there'll be a scene where Holmes is practicing with his revolver indoors, and scaring Watson's clients, who understandably aren't expecting to hear, revolver shots inside a London flat. The other thing I like about Downey Jr.'s portrayal is that it kind of makes Holmes this kind of Victorian Superman, which indeed he was originally designed as. You know, he's this very epitome of 19th century ideas on masculinity. He's a man who's become so logical and so reasoned that, you know, he's almost can do without normal everyday emotions, and in exchange for which he's able to think more clearly than ever and be into the most deepest, darkest, most complex problems. And the film explores this, but instead of, you know, being about, you know, 19th century masculinity, they show Holmes's, you know, deductive reasoning powers in these amazing visuals, you know, where he can essentially, you know, predict the future, which sounds really stupid in concept, but actually the way it works in the film is actually quite cool. Though it does mean that all action sequences take twice as long, because you see them first of all in slow motion and then you see them again sped up. It's almost like they didn't have to bother with the second thing, I always think. But anyway, yeah, I just really like Downey Jr.'s portrayal, and he does a very, very good English accent for an American actor. Sometimes American actors don't seem to be able to do very good English accents, and I'm sure, you know, for American audiences, it can be just as off-putting to hear an English actor try and speak with an American accent. But yeah, I just think Downey Jr. did a fantastic job in the role. He really gets the character down pat. Despite the fact he doesn't actually look a lot like Sherlock Holmes, he's quite short and he's very untidy, whereas in my mind anyway, Sherlock Holmes is, you know, quite tall. We know this from Conan Doyle, and fairly neatly dressed, at least when he's out and about. You know, when he's at home, you know, he probably just wears a dressing gown, you know, hangs around and smoking his pipe all the time. But yeah, this is a brilliant portrayal, and one that I think, you know, just gets better the more you see it. So at number 4 on the list, and I think this is probably going to be my most controversial choice, it's Jeremy Brett. Now, I know it's heresy in the Sherlockian community not to put him at number 1, and indeed I would like to go on record as saying I think the Granada television adaptations of Conan Doyle's work are almost certainly the greatest adaptation of Sherlock Holmes, certainly to date and probably ever. The way they get the 19th century atmosphere down is just fantastic. The way it has all this whole range of extras in the street scenes all milling around, and you never lose focus of the main characters. It's just fantastic. But having said that, Brett is not my favourite adaptation of Sherlock Holmes, the character, even if the series as a whole is my favourite adaptation. I really do like Brett. I think he's fantastic. For a start, he looks like Sherlock Holmes. I mean, he's just the image I have in my mind on screen. And he gets the mannerisms down brilliantly, the way he moves, the way he sometimes half closes his eyes when people are talking. Even the way he smokes is so just wonderfully Sherlockian. It's brilliant. I think it's probably one of the greatest performances I've ever seen, and it's probably the greatest performance of Sherlock Holmes just as a performance. But the thing that maybe I find a bit off-putting is that it doesn't quite match the Sherlock Holmes I have in my head. I think the mood swings which Brett brought to the character, because he himself suffered from bipolar disorder and he saw a similar thing as happening to the character on the pages of Conan Doyle, these mood swings which he brings in, they're quite extreme, and probably more extreme than Conan Doyle realised for the literary Sherlock Holmes. It is certainly true that in the pages of Conan Doyle, Sherlock will sometimes appear quite happy and excited, and other times quite melancholy. But Brett goes between the two extremes really extremely, and it's kind of a bit jarring and off-putting in my head. I mean, I think it's fantastic as a performance, and I really like this sort of psychological depth which Brett brought to the role. It's just fantastic. You really see inside the mind of Sherlock Holmes. I particularly like the scenes when he looks down and melancholy. Brett played the character for quite a long time, and as a result you really see him age across the series, which means that in the later series, when they actually focused a bit more on things like his drug addiction to morphine and cocaine, he really looks, you know, ill. It's fantastic as a performance. He just, in some of the scenes, and in particular one of my favourite episodes, the Devil's Foot, where he's gone away to rest and recuperate, the way he just sits at the beginning so stilly and so listlessly, and just gives you shivers. It's absolutely fantastic. So yeah, I really like Brett. I think he has a fantastic chemistry with the actor that plays Dr. Watson. I just don't think it's my favourite one. I mean, I'm really sorry, and for anyone that really likes this performance, I'm so jealous, because I really would like to put it number one. It's just fantastic. Every time I watch it, I think, oh, why don't I like this more? But sadly, it's only at number 4. At number 3, we have one of the older portrayals of Sherlock Holmes, namely Basil Rathbone. Now, this is kind of the quintessential image of Sherlock Holmes. I think Rathbone, just like Brett, really looks the part. And I think the reason I score Rathbone slightly higher than Brett is because, as I said, Brett has this, great animation to the role, which I don't necessarily see in my head when I read Conan Doyle, whereas Rathbone takes almost the complete opposite approach. He's very cold and calm without being inhuman. It's a really clever trick, and I think it works so well because it was shot in the 1940s, and therefore people, generally speaking, acted a bit more like that anyway. Indeed, the fact that it's shot in black and white and the characters all act in that quite, I won't say stiff, but that very refined, polite manner, I really think that in my head I almost feel as if it was shot in the 19th century, when of course it was actually shot, in the 20th, albeit about 25 years after the last Sherlock Holmes story was actually written. So I suppose it's not entirely stupid to see the character as being very similar in its kind of way it's portrayed as it was in the original adaptations. I really like the way Rathbone is much more of a quieter portrayal in terms of action. There are action sequences, of course, but obviously 1940s action sequences are nowhere near as exciting or complicated as, say, they are in the 21st century. So I think they spend more time on his actual detective work, and it's quite nice to sort of, when it slows down and you see the cogs in Sherlock Holmes's brain really begin to work. The other thing I like about him, of course, is that he's not completely perfect. So, for example, there's one particular scene where Holmes, to demonstrate how bad a security system is, manages to turn it off without anyone noticing, only for it to become rather embarrassing when a robbery happens just afterwards and the security system doesn't go off, because of course it hasn't, because Sherlock Holmes has just turned it off.
A grateful nation owes you a memorial, Mr. Holmes. You demonstrated your cleverness, oh, most brilliantly.
You did put your foot in it, and no mistake, Mr. Holmes.
Nonsense. How was he to know that anyone...
Oh, elementary, my dear Watson. By his deductive reasoning, of course.
Oh, shut up, Mr. Hart.
The other thing I like about the films is that they have this wonderful noir feel to them, and indeed I think that's accentuated by the names that these films are called. Things like the Scarlet Claw, or the Spider-Woman, or the House of Terror. And when I first heard about this, I thought, couldn't you call it something a bit, more refined? Like, for instance, the names of the original stories were, things like Shoscombe Old Place, or the 5 Orange Pips. But actually, it really suits the films that they are called these, rather, bizarre names. And it sort of fits in very nicely with some of the more fantasy section of Conan Doyle's work. It almost begins to go towards a kind of surreal horror element. And so, yeah, I think that really fits in well. And the fact that it's all filmed in black and white, of course, only makes it all the more creepy. So, yeah, I really like Rathbone's portrayal. I think it's brilliant. And it's no surprising that it's almost the quintessential image of Sherlock Holmes. And it's normally the standard by which other performances of Sherlock Holmes are sort of measured against. And at number 2, we have Jonny Lee Miller. Now, I am a massive fan of the American series Elementary. I think it's better than its British equivalent Sherlock. I might be slightly controversial in thinking that. I don't know. But I just love Lee Miller so much. His portrayal of Sherlock is probably the most in-depth portrait of the great detective that there's ever been. The way it really unpicks central areas of the mythos, like why does Sherlock work with Watson? Or why does Sherlock take drugs? It's such a clever portrayal. It really delves down deeply and doesn't just take things as fact because that's how Conan Doyle wrote them. It looks at why that would work in real life. I particularly like the way it looks at Sherlock's gifts. I remember when the British BBC show Sherlock came out, One of my friends said to me, "Oh, it must be brilliant being see all these details. You know, it must be so cool. I wish I was a a high functioning sociopath. It would be great." And indeed, from Sherlock, you'd think it was. I mean, the only downside is that you're not particularly good at interacting with other people. But I mean, who doesn't find it complicated to interact with other people at times? It seems a pretty good trade-off. But Elementary really looks at what it would actually be like to have really high functioning senses. So what would it be like if your sense of sight was really good, your sense of hearing, your sense of smell, your sense of taste, touch, everything? And it actually makes you feel sorry for Sherlock Holmes, which is something I never thought would be possible. It really makes him feel, almost a martyr to these biological senses that he's been given. I mean, he didn't ask for them. And it frames his work as not only a way of helping people, which it obviously is, but it's also a way of just using his senses so they don't hurt as much, which is really sad, and it kind of adds to the dark edges of the character. The other thing I like about it is that it sort of portrays Sherlock as being a man constantly fighting against the darkness inside of him, which is not necessarily something that's central to Conan Doyle's portrayal, but certainly something you could extrapolate from them.
You could have killed Agent Matu. From your perspective, it would have been the expedient thing.
And yet, to you, it would have been repugnant. Tell me, is that how you learned to be one of them? By learning to care how your actions seemed in the eyes of another?
I'm not sure I am one of them.
Generally speaking, in the books, Sherlock has a very strong sense of rightness and wrongness. But the series Elementary and Miller in his portrayal really looks at why Sherlock has that kind of sensibility. Why isn't he like, say, Moriarty, who has no moral compass whatsoever? And the reason they come to is essentially he's terrified of becoming like Moriarty, which is odd because the fact that he's frightened of it means that he never can become it. But you sometimes see these little kind of glimpses into what he would be like if he was a criminal, and it's actually quite scary.
What is that? Hey, I said no phones. Hey, I said no phones.
The other thing I like about Jonny Lee Miller's portrayal is just little things, like the way he stands. He always stands bolt upright, and he has a kind of pugnacious, aggressive expression on his face the entire time. It's like he's constantly fighting against the world, which explains why he's always slightly on edge, apart from when he's, say, with people that he trusts, like Inspector Gregson or Detective Bell or Joan Watson. It really explains a lot about the character, and it's just a wonderful little detail. I also like things like that most people probably wouldn't even notice unless they're a geek like me. The fact that in the first series, when he's really just out of rehab and he's struggling to recover from his addiction, he dresses quite sloppily. But in the flashback, you see, to his work in London, he's dressed very smartly. And then at the beginning of the second series, he's dressed smartly again, and he goes through the entire series as dressed in mainly suits. I like the idea that, it shows just through his costume how he's coming back to what he originally was, albeit with the baggage that he's carrying through his addiction. So yeah, it's just a fantastic performance. I mean, I really like Jonny Lee Miller in virtually everything he's done. And if you see an interview with him, you realise how much of his portrayal of Sherlock Holmes is acting. I don't mean to sound rude to say, Benedict Cumberbatch, because, he's a brilliant actor as well. But his everyday voice, it's not that far removed from the voice he does when he's Sherlock. You can tell that he's acting, obviously, but it's broadly similar. Whereas if you see Jonny Lee Miller in interviews, he's really quiet and quite shy, which means that it was a really amazing performance, the way he just switches on when he's on camera, and he's suddenly this, confident, pugnacious, intellectual genius. It's brilliant. So yeah, I really like his portrayal. I think it's brilliant. But it's not number one. Number one on my list is Peter Cushing. Now, I think this is probably quite an unusual choice. Cushing didn't play the role that much. He was in the Hammer horror film The Hound of the Baskervilles, and then he later on starred in a BBC adaptation during the late 60s. I think it was about 12 or 15 episodes, and even Cushing himself said that he didn't think that his portrayal was very good in the BBC show because he was so tired because of the hectic shooting schedule that he said he was just grateful to be able to say the lines rather than say them like Sherlock Holmes. Which is amazing to me because I really like his performance. I think it's fair to say that the entire BBC series is not as good as the later ITV adaptation in the 80s with Jeremy Brett in them. But I prefer Cushing's Holmes to Brett's because I think Cushing gives the character a bit more feeling to it. He doesn't feel quite so removed from real life. He feels like someone you could literally go out in the street and meet. He's also quite charming as well in a very Victorian kind of way. I really like the little interplays he has with Watson rather than the slightly spikier relationship which Brett had with his Watson. Cushing has a great liveliness in the role. You really get the sense that he really enjoys being Sherlock Holmes, and indeed, as Sherlock Holmes, he really enjoys deducing things. He does, obviously, get bored, he gets tired, and he does get angry, but it's more in the kind of the bounds of normality rather than being a bit more extreme. I was quite surprised when I saw his adaptation because I always thought that his portrayal of Sherlock Holmes would be similar to the way he portrayed Van Helsing in the Hammer horror film Dracula. And indeed, Van Helsing is, at first inspection, quite a similar character to Sherlock Holmes. Van Helsing goes around looking for vampires, Holmes goes around looking for criminals. But it's a completely different portrayal. It's not cold at all, it's very lively and friendly, and with just a hint of menace underneath it, that when Cushing does really lose his temper and you see this sort of just rage underneath, it has much more impact than, say, when Jeremy Brett does it, because Jeremy Brett is constantly going between the two extremes of sort of great highs and great lows throughout his portrayal, whereas Cushing is generally quite polite and refined, and then when he does lose it, it really has that punch behind it. He was also just wonderfully, snarkily polite. It's brilliant. It feels very Victorian. He'll meet, say, a client that wants him to do a job that he doesn't want to do, and the way he refuses is just fantastic.
You are perverse, Mr. Holmes. In spite of the fact that I have decided you are the correct person to undertake this quest, you deliberately flout me. Now why, sir?
Your case is that of a sneak thief, Lady Morcar. There is not a single aspect of it which was of any interest to me.
Good day, Lady Morcar.
So yeah, that was my top 10 Sherlock Holmeses. I hope you enjoyed that, and please comment in the comments section if you agree, disagree, what your top 10s maybe are. I'd really look forward to seeing some of them. I mean, as I said, this isn't a definitive list by any means, and I don't think I've even seen every single actor to ever portray the character. So I might have to redo the list once I have done. But yeah, that was the Sherlockian. Thank you very much for watching, film fans, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.